In all of human history, few days are so dark. One day, one battle. One afternoon that saw the death of over 50,000 men. It was not a battle, it was an extermination. It was the moment a republic destined to rule the known world was brought to the very edge of oblivion, its entire future hanging by a single, blood-soaked thread. This catastrophe, this terrifying masterpiece of destruction, was the singular vision of one man. A man who, as a small child, was led to a smoking altar by his father, placed his hand upon the sacrifice, and swore a sacred binding oath, an oath of eternal hatred for Rome. Our story begins not with the battle, but with the peace that came before it. A false peace. A bitter, simmering quiet that poisoned the air of the Mediterranean. The First Punic War had ended. The two great titans of the age, the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire, had pulled back from their bloody embrace. Carthage, the ancient city of merchants, the queen of the seas, was humiliated. She was stripped of her jewel Sicily and forced to pay a crippling indemnity, a mountain of silver that emptied her treasuries. But the gold was not the true cost. The true cost was pride. In Carthage lived a general named Hannibal Barca. They called him the Thunderbolt. He was the finest commander Carthage had. A man who had never been defeated by the Romans on land. He watched as his own government, a senate of wealthy merchants, terrified of losing their trade routes, capitulated to Rome. He felt betrayed, not by the enemy, but by his home. Rome was different. Rome was not a city of merchants. It was a republic of farmers, soldiers, and senators. It was young, aggressive, stubborn, and built on iron discipline. Where Carthage saw profit, Rome saw conquest. Rome was the wolf at the door, and Hamilcar knew the wolf would one day return to finish the job. He decided he would not wait for that day. If the Senate in Carthage would not support him, he would build his own empire. He turned his eyes to Iberia, the land we now call Spain. A wild land, rich with silver mines, and filled with some of the most ferocious warriors in the world. There, far from the wavering politicians, he would forge a new army. An army loyal not to Carthage, but to him. An army that would be the instrument of his revenge. One day before setting sail for Iberia, Hamilcar was making a sacrifice to the gods, praying for success in his new venture. His son, a small boy named Hannibal, only 9 years old, watched his father. He asked to go with him to Iberia. Hamilcar looked at his son. He saw the same fire he felt in himself. He agreed, on one condition. He led the boy into the temple, to the inner sanctum, to the smoking altar of their god, Balhaman. He told his son to place his small hand upon the sacrifice, and there, in the firelight and shadows of the temple, he made his 9-year-old son swear a solemn oath. He was to swear that he would never, ever be a friend to the Roman people. Hannibal swore it. He would later say he swore to be their enemy for all time. This oath became the engine of the story. It was the whisper in Hannibal's ear for the rest of his life. His childhood was not spent in palaces. His playground was an Iberian military camp. His lullabies were the songs of Gallic mercenaries, the clash of Iberian steel, and the thunder of Numidian cavalry. He learned to speak Spanish and Gallic. In Greek, he learned to sleep on the hard ground, wrapped in a simple soldier's cloak. He learned to fight, to lead, and most importantly, to hate the name of Rome. For years, Hamilcar carved out a kingdom in Spain. He built his army, paid for with Spanish silver. But the thunderbolt eventually falls. Hamilcar was killed in battle, drowned in a river, while saving his sons. His command passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the project. Building a magnificent new capital, New Carthage, Hasdrubal governed with diplomacy. He built treaties. He consolidated their power. But the shadow of Rome loomed. Rome, nervous about this new Carthaginian power, forced a treaty with Hasdrubal. Carthage could not cross the Ebro River in force. Then one night an assassin's knife found Hasdrubal. The army was left without a leader. The soldiers did not wait for the Senate in Carthage to send a replacement. They did not want a politician. They wanted a Barca. They marched to the tent of the young man who had grown up among them, the man who was Hamilcar's blood. They cheered his name, raised him on their shields, proclaimed him their commander. Hannibal Barca was 26 years old. The boy who had made the oath was now a man in command of an army, and the instrument of vengeance forged for a decade in the fires of Iberia was finally ready to be unleashed. The world did not know it yet, but the Second Punic War had begun. Hannibal was in command. But an army without a war is just a parade. The oath he swore demanded blood, and Rome was an ocean away. He could not simply march on them. He needed a cause, a justification that would rally his men and, crucially, force the politicians back in Carthage to support him. He needed a pretext. He found it in a city of gray stone on the Iberian coast. The city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a problem. It was a native Iberian city, but it was also a formal ally of Rome. Here was the legal ambiguity Hannibal craved. The city lay south of the Ebro River, which, according to the treaty his brother-in-law had signed, placed it squarely within the Carthaginian sphere of influence. However, its alliance with Rome made it a Roman proxy. A dagger pointed at the heart of Hannibal's new province. Hannibal saw Saguntum not as a threat, but as a test of wills. He began by provoking skirmishes, accusing the Saguntines of attacking neighboring tribes who were under Carthaginian protection. The Saguntines, terrified, sent desperate messages to Rome pleading for help. Rome, ever arrogant, did not send an army. They sent ambassadors. This was Hannibal's first move in the great game. The Roman delegation arrived at his camp in New Carthage, draped in the formal white togas of the Republic. They were led by senior senators, men used to being obeyed. They demanded that Hannibal, this 26-year-old upstart, leave their ally Saguntum alone. Hannibal made them wait, and when he finally saw them, he treated them with a cool, calculated contempt. He explained that Carthage was merely defending its own allies from Saguntine aggression. He told the Romans that they had no right to interfere in Spain south of the Ebro. He was polite, but his message was clear: get out. Furious and frustrated, the Roman ambassadors did the only thing they could. They sailed to Carthage itself to appeal to the government that supposedly controlled this rogue general. They believed the civilized merchants of the Carthaginian Senate would surely see reason. They were wrong. When the Romans stood before the Carthaginian Senate, they were met not with apologies, but with debate. An old rival of the Barca family, a powerful noble named Hanno the Great, stood up. Hanno was the leader of the peace faction. He despised the Barcas, seeing them as warmongering adventurers who would bring ruin upon the city. He argued passionately, his voice echoing in the great hall. He told the Senate that this was not Carthage's war. This was Hannibal's private war. He warned them that if they supported this boy's madness, they would be inviting the Roman legions to their very gates. He implored them to do the sensible thing, to arrest Hannibal, to hand him over to the Romans, and to pay damages for the trouble he had caused. But Hanno's voice of reason was drowned out by a rising tide of pride and resentment. The Barca faction, flush with Spanish silver, argued that Rome had no right to dictate their foreign policy. Had they not suffered enough humiliation? Was it not time for Carthage to stand tall again? The Senate, poisoned by years of simmering anger and emboldened by the wealth Hannibal sent them, voted to support their general. They told the Roman ambassadors that the Saguntines were the aggressors, and that Rome should look to its own affairs. The ambassadors left with nothing. Hannibal, back in Spain, had received his answer. He had a blank check. In the spring of 219 BC, Hannibal marched his army to the walls of Saguntum and laid siege. He had expected a quick victory. He was mistaken. The Saguntines, knowing that surrender meant slavery and that their only hope was for a Roman relief force, fought with the fury of the doomed. The siege lasted for 8 brutal months. This was no simple blockade. Hannibal's army was a sophisticated killing machine filled with engineers and siege experts. They built massive ramps of earth and timber, pushing them against the walls. They constructed giant siege towers, draped in wet hides to protect them from fire, and wheeled them forward, raining javelins and stones on the defenders. They used battering rams to pound at the foundations. The Saguntines fought back for every inch. They sallied out in desperate counterattacks, burning the siege engines. They hurled boiling oil and heavy stones. The fighting was personal hand-to-hand, a desperate, bloody struggle on the crumbling ramparts. Hannibal himself was badly wounded, struck in the thigh by a javelin, and had to be carried from the field. His men, enraged at seeing their leader fall, redoubled their assault. Finally, after 8 months, the walls were breached beyond repair. The city was starving. The Roman relief army they had prayed for never came. What happened next was a message to the world. The Saguntine leaders, seeing that all was lost, gathered their city's gold and silver in the public square. They piled it with wood, and then, one by one, they walked into the flames, choosing suicide over surrender. Hannibal's troops poured into the smoking ruins. They were given no orders to show mercy. The remaining population was either slaughtered or rounded up to be sold into slavery. The city of Saguntum was effectively erased from the map. Hannibal, now recovered from his wound, stood among the ruins. He had his victory. He had his pretext, and he had a massive amount of plunder which he shrewdly distributed, some to his troops to ensure their loyalty, and a vast portion sent back to Carthage to silence the last remaining critics like Hanno, back in Rome. The news of Saguntum's fall struck the city like a thunderclap. This was not a border skirmish. This was the annihilation of a Roman ally. Their pride was shattered. Their credibility was on the line. They had been humiliated by a young general they had dismissed as a boy. The Roman Senate, convened in a mood of grim determination, they would send one final embassy to Carthage. This time there would be no negotiation. This time it was an ultimatum. The delegation was led by a senior statesman, a man of iron will and unshakable Roman gravity, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius, who would one day become Hannibal's greatest nemesis, stood before the Carthaginian Senate for the second time. He did not come to debate treaties or borders. He came for a decision. He stood before them, silent, and gathered the folds of his heavy toga in his hand. He looked at the assembled Carthaginian nobles. "I hold here," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire republic, both peace and war. "Choose which one you will have." The Carthaginian senators, still arrogant, still drunk on Hannibal's victory, shouted back at him, "Choose for yourself." Fabius paused, letting the defiant challenge hang in the air. Then he dramatically shook out the folds of his toga, as if releasing something terrible into the room. Then he declared, "We give you war." The die was cast. The formal declaration was made. The Second Punic War was no longer a shadow. It was a reality. In New Carthage, Hannibal gathered his army, a force of nearly 100,000 men. He had spent the winter making his final preparations. When the news of Rome's declaration arrived, he was not surprised. He was ready. He stood before his men, the Iberians, the Gauls, the Libyans, the Numidians. He told them what Rome had done. He told them that the Romans wanted not just his head, but all of them, to be crucified as rebels. And then he revealed his plan. They would not wait for the Romans to cross the sea. They would not fight a defensive war in the mountains of Spain. They would do the one thing the Romans believed to be utterly impossible. They would take the war to Italy itself. They would march. And they would not march by sea. They would march by land, through hostile territory, over the impassable mountains, to the very gates of Rome. The war was declared. Rome, confident in its power, prepared for a conventional fight. Their strategy was simple, logical, and thoroughly Roman. They would send one army, led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, to Spain, to confront Hannibal in his own territory. They would send a second army, led by the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, to Sicily, where he would prepare to invade Carthage itself. The Romans were not planning to defend. They were planning to attack. They believed the war would be fought on their terms. Far from home, they had not accounted for the mind of Hannibal Barca, while the Roman legions were still mustering. Hannibal moved. In the spring of 218 BC, he left his brother Hasdrubal in command of Spain, marched his army of nearly 100,000 men toward the Pyrenees, the first Great Barrier. This was not just a march. It was a culling. He fought his way through the Pyrenea tribes, but he also did something brilliant. He allowed nearly 10,000 of his Iberian troops, men who were homesick and hesitant, to return to their homes. This was not weakness. It was a filter. Hannibal did not want an army of conscripts. He wanted an army of true believers. He was shedding the unwilling, forging a core of men who were there because they chose to follow him. When he descended from the Pyrenees into Gaul, his army was smaller, but it was harder, more loyal, more determined. He marched his men across southern Gaul at a terrifying pace. His goal was the Rhone River, the next great obstacle. But by now, Rome was moving. Publius Scipio's army had landed by sea at Massilia, modern-day Marseille, near the mouth of the Rhone. Scipio expected to find Hannibal in Spain. Instead, he heard rumors that the Carthaginian army was just a few days' march away. Hannibal reached the Rhone to find a local Gallic tribe, the Volcae, allied with Rome and mobilized to stop him. They lined the far bank, thousands of warriors screaming insults and brandishing their weapons. A direct assault across the wide, fast-moving river would be a slaughter, so Hannibal turned to deception. That night, under the cover of darkness, he sent a strong detachment of his army under a commander named Hanno on a forced march upriver. They crossed the Rhone at a shallower, guarded point and moved silently into position behind the Gallic camp. 2 days later, Hanno's men sent up the prearranged smoke signal. As the Gauls on the riverbank saw the smoke rising from their own camp, they heard the terrifying war cries of Hannibal's main army beginning to cross. The main force was a chaotic, brilliant spectacle. Cavalry swam alongside their horses, which were tethered to small boats. Infantry crossed on massive rafts. The elephants, terrified of the water, were tricked onto enormous barges, covered in earth and foliage to resemble solid ground, and ferried across. The Gauls, caught between the river assault and Hanno's attack from their rear, panicked and fled. The crossing was secured. It was a masterpiece of logistics and timing, but just as the last of his men were crossing, Hannibal's Numidian scouts came thundering back to the camp, pursued by a cloud of dust. They had run headlong into a Roman cavalry patrol. Publius Scipio, alerted to Hannibal's presence, had sent his horsemen upriver to find him. A brief, vicious cavalry skirmish erupted. It was the first time Carthaginian and Roman blood was spilled in this new war. The Romans, though outnumbered, fought with disciplined fury before retreating. They returned to their consul with stunning news. Hannibal was not in Spain. He was here, and he was not retreating. He was marching north. Scipio was a traditional Roman general. He could not comprehend what was happening. He raced his army to Hannibal's crossing point, but he was 3 days too late. Hannibal and his entire army were gone, vanished into the interior of Gaul. Scipio stood on the banks of the Rhone, staring north. There was only one insane possibility. Hannibal was going to the Alps. Scipio made a crucial decision. He sent his main army on to Spain to cut off Hannibal's supply lines, a move that would have profound consequences later. But he himself took a ship and raced back to northern Italy to warn the Republic. The monster was not at the gate. The monster was taking a path no army had ever taken, to land in their unprotected backyard. And what a path it was. Hannibal marched his men, now numbering around 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants, to the foot of the mountains. It was late autumn. The first snows were already falling. The mountain passes were not just difficult, they were closing. The locals warned him that it was suicide. The ascent was a waking nightmare. The paths were narrow, goat tracks, not roads for an army. Men and heavily laden pack animals slipped on the scree, falling thousands of feet into the icy ravines below. The cold was a physical enemy. It seeped into their bones, killing the men who sat to rest, and then came the human enemy. The mountain tribes, the Allobroges and others, saw this column of exhausted foreigners as a rich prize. They laid ambushes, rolling massive boulders down from the cliffs, crushing men and horses. They attacked the supply train, showering the column with arrows and javelins. Hannibal had to fight for every step. He would use his elephants, which the tribes had never seen, to clear the path. Their terrifying appearance and trumpeting calls scattering the attackers, he would lead night raids on their villages to secure passage. It was a 15-day journey through a white hell. The army was bleeding men at every turn, not just from battle, but from starvation, exposure, and accidents. After 9 days of climbing, they reached the summit, a bleak, wind-scoured plateau. For 2 days, the army rested, a huddled mass of misery. The snow was deep. They were exhausted, starving, and demoralized. It was here that Hannibal walked among his men, stood on a high precipice, and pointed south. Through a break in the clouds, they could see it, a faint green haze in the far, far distance. It was the Po Valley. It was Italy. He gathered his officers and told them to look. He told them that what they saw was their reward. They were not just climbing the walls of Italy. They were climbing the walls of Rome itself. 1 or 2 more battles, he promised them, and the riches of the Republic would be theirs. He put iron back into their spines, but the descent was worse. The southern side of the Alps was steeper, and the new snow had covered treacherous ice from the year before. Men and animals lost their footing, sliding into the abyss. The column would bunch up, and a slip from one horse could take a dozen men with it. At one point, a landslide had wiped out the path completely. They were stuck. According to the historian Livy, they were forced to cut a new road out of the sheer cliff face. In a famous, perhaps legendary display of engineering, they built massive fires against the rock, and when it was red hot, they doused it with sour wine, causing the rock to crack and shatter, allowing them to chip their way through. For 3 more days of hell, they cut their way down, until finally, the shattered remnants of the army stumbled out of the foothills and into the green plains of northern Italy. The impossible journey was complete, but the cost was staggering. When Hannibal Barca left the Rhone River, he had an army of roughly 46,000 men. When he arrived in Italy, he mustered his survivors. He had only 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left. Thousands upon thousands of men and most of his elephants now lay frozen in the ice and rock of the Alps. He had lost almost half his army without even seeing a Roman legion. But what was left was not an army. It was a single living weapon. A corps of survivors from Spain, Africa, and Gaul who had crossed the Pyrenees, the Rhone, now the Alps. They were tempered by ice, blood, and the unshakable will of their commander. They were bound to him by a loyalty that went beyond nations or gold. Hannibal was in Italy. The greatest gamble in military history had paid off. And Rome, fat, comfortable, and arrogant, was completely, terrifyingly unprepared. Hannibal was in Italy, but he was in command of a ghost army. 26,000 starving survivors surrounded by a hostile nation. He was not in Roman territory yet. He was in Cisalpine Gaul, a region Rome had brutally conquered only a few years earlier. The local Gallic tribes hated Rome, but they were terrified of her. Before Hannibal could fight the legions, he needed to win the Gauls. He needed food, he needed supplies, and most of all, he needed men. He did not come as a beggar. He came as a liberator, but a liberator who understood that power respects only power. When a local tribe, the Taurine, refused to join him, he made a terrible and swift example. He besieged their main town, took it by storm in 3 days, put the survivors to the sword. The message was brutal and clear. Join me, and I will be your shield against Rome. Resist me, and I will be your destruction. The Gallic tribes, seeing this new, violent power, and nursing their own deep hatred of Rome, began to stir. Their warriors, thousands of them, began to trickle and then to flow into Hannibal's camp, eager to reclaim their freedom. Meanwhile, the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the man who had missed Hannibal at the Rhone, had landed in northern Italy. He had taken command of the local Roman legions, forces that were inexperienced, garrison troops. He was a good conventional Roman general, and he did the conventional Roman thing. He marched his army to find the enemy and destroy him. He still believed he was fighting a barbarian rabble, an army that had been shattered by its impossible journey. He was about to learn the truth. Near the Ticinus River, the cavalry patrols of the two armies spotted each other. This was not a full battle, but a large-scale reconnaissance in force. Scipio rode at the front of his Roman cavalry, supplemented by Gallic horsemen of questionable loyalty. Hannibal rode with his elite cavalry, the men who had been with him from Spain, and his secret weapon, the Numidians. The Numidians were unlike any cavalry the Romans had ever seen. They rode small, tough horses without saddles or bridles, guiding them with only their knees and a small neck rope. They did not fight in heavy charging formations. They were a swarm. They would ride in, hurl javelins with deadly accuracy, and then wheel away before the Romans could countercharge. They were liquid death, a cloud of hornets that could not be swatted as the two forces clashed. The Numidians did not just attack the front. They flowed around the Roman flanks. The Roman cavalry, fighting in their rigid, heavy style, were suddenly being attacked from three sides at once. The Roman line buckled. Their Gallic allies, seeing the chaos, broke and fled. Scipio, fighting bravely at the front, was surrounded. A javelin pierced his side, badly wounding him. He slumped on his horse, about to be cut down. It was at this moment, according to the historian Livy, that his 17-year-old son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, saw his father's plight. The young Scipio, who would one day be known to history as Scipio Africanus, cut his way through the chaos. Shielding his father and dragging him back from the brink of death, Hannibal's first nemesis had just been saved. By his ultimate one, the battle was a rout. The Roman cavalry was shattered. Scipio, humiliated and in agony, retreated his entire army. His confidence was broken. He now understood. This was no barbarian horde. This was a professional army led by a tactical genius. He pulled his remaining forces back to a more defensible position near the town of Placentia, dug in, and waited for help, his wound festering. When the news of this defeat reached Rome, the city, which had been so confident, felt its first cold stab of real fear. The planned invasion of Africa was immediately canceled. The Senate sent an urgent message to the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius, Longus, in Sicily. He was to abandon his plans, embark his entire army, and march north with all possible speed. The two consuls were to link up, and their combined armies were to crush this invader. Longus, his dreams of glory in Africa dashed, obeyed. He marched his men the length of Italy, a punishing 40-day trek, and finally linked up with Scipio's recovering army. Now, two Roman consuls, with a combined army of over 40,000 men, faced Hannibal. And here Hannibal's genius for war revealed itself to be not just tactical, but psychological. He began to study his opponents. Scipio, wounded and having tasted the sting of the Numidians, was now cautious. He argued for a delay. He wanted to wait to train his new troops, to let the winter wear down Hannibal's army, whose Gallic allies might prove fickle. Longus, however, was the exact opposite. He was impulsive, arrogant, and desperately hungry for glory. His term as consul was about to end in a few weeks. He wanted this victory, and he wanted it now. He saw Scipio's caution as cowardice. Hannibal saw this division, this clash of egos, and he smiled. He knew exactly which consul to provoke. The two armies were camped on opposite sides of the Trebia River. It was late December. The weather was miserable, a mixture of freezing rain and snow. The river was swollen, its water ice cold. Hannibal formulated his plan. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. The night before the battle, in the freezing darkness, he ordered his younger brother, Hannibal Barca, to take 2,000 of their best men, a mix of infantry and cavalry, and hide them. They crept out of the camp and concealed themselves in a deep, wooded ravine, a drainage ditch that was overgrown with brush. They were to lie there, silent and freezing, and wait for the signal at the first light of dawn. Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the river to attack the Roman camp. They thundered up to the Roman stockades, hurling javelins and screaming insults, specifically targeting the tent of the consul Laus. It was the perfect bait. Longus, enraged, did exactly what Hannibal predicted. He awoke his entire army from their sleep. Against the desperate advice of Scipio, he ordered an immediate, full-scale attack. The Roman soldiers, groggy and empty-bellied, did not even have time for breakfast. They formed up in the freezing pre-dawn dark and were ordered to advance. The Numidians, their job done, feigned a retreat. Luring the Romans on, the entire Roman army, 40,000 strong, marched down to the Trebia River and waded in. The water was chest-deep and mind-numbingly cold. They stumbled across the rocky riverbed, their shields and weapons heavy, their tunics soaked and freezing to their skin. By the time they emerged on the far bank, they were not soldiers. They were half-frozen, starving, waterlogged wretches, and there, waiting for them on the plain, was Hannibal's army. His men were well-rested. They had eaten a hot breakfast and oiled their bodies to protect against the cold. They were dry. They were ready. The battle began. The Roman infantry, the legionaries, were the best in the world. Even cold and hungry, their central block of 10,000 men fought with incredible discipline. They punched a hole straight through the center of Hannibal's line, which was made of his weaker Gallic allies. But the battle was not being decided in the center. On the flanks, Hannibal's superior cavalry and his few remaining elephants crashed into the Roman cavalry. The Roman horses, already spooked, were routed. The Carthaginian horsemen, led by Hasdrubal, shattered them and then wheeled around, slamming into the exposed flanks of the Roman infantry. The Roman legions were now being pressed from the front and squeezed from both sides. And then Hannibal gave the signal. From the ravine in their rear, where they had lain in ambush all morning, Hannibal Barca and his 2,000 elite troops erupted. They smashed into the back of the Roman line. The trap was complete. Attacked from the front, from both flanks, and now, devastatingly, from behind, the Roman army ceased to be an army. It became a trapped, screaming mass of men. It was a slaughter. The cold, the panic, and the Carthaginian steel did their work. Only the 10,000 legionaries in the center, the ones who had broken through early, managed to escape. They simply kept marching, cutting their way out of the trap, and finding refuge in the nearby town of Placentia. The rest, nearly 30,000 men, were killed, captured, or drowned trying to retreat back across the river. Hannibal had lost his first army in the Alps. Now, Rome had lost its first army in Italy. The victory at the Trebia was a catastrophe for the Republic. The news hit Rome like an earthquake. The boogeyman was not just in their backyard. He was unstoppable. He had defeated one consul, and now he had annihilated another. The road to the south, the road to Rome itself, lay open. The victory at the Trebia gave Hannibal possession of northern Italy. The winter of 218 BC was a time for rest, for healing, and for growth. The Gauls, now convinced that Hannibal was the real deal, flocked to his banner by the tens of thousands, eager to join the man who had humbled their Roman masters. His army, which had been so depleted by the Alps, was now larger than when he had started. Back in Rome, the city was gripped by a grim new reality. This was not a distant war. It was a fire in their own home. But Rome did not panic, not yet. This was a republic of iron. When disaster struck, they did not negotiate. They elected new consuls and raised new legions. For the year 217 BC, they chose two men, Gnaeus Cerilius Geminus, a steady, unremarkable patrician, and Gaius Flaminius, a man who was anything but. Flaminius was a new man, a populist politician who had risen to power by championing the causes of the common people, which made him despised by the old guard Senate. He was fiercely arrogant, deeply ambitious, and utterly convinced that the disasters of the previous year were due to the incompetence of his predecessors, not the genius of Hannibal. He was also, in the eyes of the Senate, dangerously impious. In his rush to take command of his new army, he skipped the traditional solemn religious festivals in Rome. He did not wait for the omens. He rode north, consumed by his own self-importance. Believing he was the man who would save the Republic, Hannibal, resting in his winter camp, studied his new opponent. And just as he had read Longus, he now read Flaminius. He knew this was a man driven by ego, a man who could be goaded. When spring came, Hannibal had to move. He had to take the war south, into the heart of Italy, to threaten Rome itself. The new Roman armies were blocking the conventional roads. Cerealis had an army at Arimone on the east coast, and Flaminius had his army at Aridome on the west, guarding the main passes into Etruria, so Hannibal once again did the impossible. He looked at the one path the Romans believed no army could take, the flooded marshes of the Arno River. For 4 days and 3 nights, his army marched through a nightmare. They waded in a foul, putrid swamp, with water that was often waist-deep. There was no dry land to sleep. The men rested on the bloated corpses of their pack animals, or slept slumped over their horses. Disease ran rampant. The stench was unbearable. Men drowned in the mud. Hannibal himself, refusing to show weakness, rode on the last of his elephants. A massive beast named Cerus, or the Syrian. He was above the water, but not immune. The constant dampness, the insects, and the fetid air led to a violent infection in his right eye. He refused to stop, refused to rest. By the time the army staggered out of the swamp onto dry land, thousands of his new Gallic allies were dead. And Hannibal, the general who saw everything, was now half blind. His right eye was lost forever. He was now in Etruria, the rich heartland of central Italy, and he was, crucially, south of Flaminius's army. He was between the Roman consul and the city of Rome, but Hannibal did not march on the city. He began a calculated campaign of psychological terror. He unleashed his army on the countryside. He began to burn everything. He torched the farms, the fields, and the rich villas of the Roman nobles. He created a plume of smoke so vast it could be seen from Flaminius's camp. He was sending a message directly to the consul. "I am here, destroying the land you are sworn to protect. What are you going to do about it?" In the Roman camp, Flaminius's officers begged him to wait. His consular colleague Cerealis was marching to join him. They should link their armies. They should not fight Hannibal alone. But Flaminius was consumed by rage. He was being humiliated. Hannibal was openly mocking him. The populist politician could not be seen cowering in his camp while Italy burned. Ignoring all advice, he gave the order. The army would break camp and pursue. Hannibal, his one eye watching, smiled. The fish was on the hook. He led the furious, pursuing Roman army on a chase, until he found the place he had been looking for. It was a lake called Lake Trasimene. A narrow road ran along its northern shore. On the other side of the road, a line of steep, wooded hills rose up, creating a perfect, natural corridor. A trap. That night, Hannibal did something extraordinary. He marched his entire army, more than 30,000 men, into the hills overlooking the lake. He did not just hide them. He deployed them for battle, in the dark, in total silence. At the far end of the narrow road, the exit of the pass, he placed his best troops. His veteran Spanish and African infantry, to act as a solid wall. Along the entire mile-long length of the hills, overlooking the road, he hid his Gallic infantry and his light troops, the javelin men and slingers. And at the entrance to the pass, where the Romans would march in, he hid his elite cavalry and his Numidians in a ravine, ready to close the door the next morning. June 21st, 217 BC, a miracle happened for Hannibal, and a curse for Rome. A thick, wet fog rolled off the lake, clinging to the road and the low ground, completely obscuring the path. But the hills, where Hannibal's army lay in wait, were clear, bathed in the morning sun. They could see everything. The Romans below them would see nothing. Geminius, blind with rage and now literally blind by the fog, ordered his army to advance. The Roman army marched directly into the trap. They were not in battle formation. They were in a long, snaking, marching column, unit by unit, completely vulnerable. The head of the column, the vanguard, marched for miles along the lakeside, deeper and deeper into the pass. Suddenly the vanguard halted. They had run into Hannibal's heavy infantry, blocking the road. The long Roman column began to bunch up, confused. Men bumping into each other in the thick gray fog, and then Hannibal gave the signal from the rear. The Carthaginian cavalry thundered out of their hiding place, smashing into the tail of the Roman column, sealing the entrance. The trap was sprung, and from the hills a sound like an avalanche. 30,000 Gauls and Iberians screamed their war cries and charged downhill, crashing into the entire exposed flank of the Roman army. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Romans were not even facing their attackers. They were in a line, and the enemy was coming from their left and from their front and from their back. They were trapped between the hillside of death and the cold waters of the lake. There was no order. There was no line of battle. There was only panic and slaughter. Men were cut down before they could even draw their swords. Units were annihilated before they could form up. The lake turned red as thousands of Romans, in their heavy armor, waded into the water to escape, only to be cut down by cavalry or to drown under the weight of their own gear. Gaius Flaminius, the arrogant consul, rode frantically through the chaos, trying to rally his men. But he was spotted. A Gallic horseman, whose tribe Flaminius had once wronged, recognized the consul's splendid armor. He spurred his horse through the mob and ran Flaminius through with a spear. In 3 hours, it was over. An entire consular army, 15,000 Romans, lay dead on the shore of the lake. Another 10,000 were captured, rounded up as the fog finally lifted, revealing the scale of the horror. But the nightmare was not over. Hannibal learned that the other consul, Cerealis, had sent his entire cavalry force, 4,000 men, to reinforce Flaminius. Hannibal sent his own cavalry, under his brilliant commander Maharbel, to intercept them. 2 days later, they too were surrounded and destroyed. In the span of a few days, Rome had lost its second consular army of the war, and the entire mounted force of its third. 2 consuls were defeated. 1 was dead. There was now no Roman army of any consequence between Hannibal and the city of Rome. When the news reached the city, the praetor stood in the forum and gave a famously short, terrifying announcement to the trembling crowd. "We have been defeated in a great battle. The city broke. The Hannibalic terror had begun. The Republic, for the first in its history, was on the verge of total collapse." Rome was broken. When the news of Trasimene arrived, it was not just a report of a defeat. It was a death notice for the Republic. The city, for the first time in its history, fell into a state of uncontrolled public panic. The gates were barred. The women of Rome, many of whom had just lost sons, brothers and husbands at Trebia, now learned they had lost the rest at Trasimene. They ran through the streets, wailing, crowding the temples, and sweeping the altars with their unbound hair. Begging the gods for a mercy that had not come, the Senate met in continuous session. The patrician fathers pale and grim. 2 consular armies had been vaporized. A third had its cavalry surgically removed. There was, at that moment, no significant Roman army in the field between Hannibal and the 7 hills of Rome. They expected at any hour to see the one-eyed general and his Carthaginian standards on the horizon, but Hannibal did not come. His lieutenants, chief among them the cavalry commander Maharbel, urged him to march. "Ride with me," Maharbel famously said. "In 5 days you will dine on the capital." But Hannibal, the master of the battlefield, knew the limits of his victory. He had no siege engines to break the massive walls of Rome. His army, now mostly Gauls, was a field army, not a siege army, and they were notoriously unreliable for long, grinding campaigns. His strategy was not to destroy the city of Rome, but to destroy its power. He had to prove to Rome's Italian allies, the Samnites, the Campanians, the Greeks in the south, that the Republic could no longer protect them. He needed to break the Roman Confederacy, to pull the bricks out of their wall one by one, until the entire structure collapsed. So he bypassed Rome. He turned his army south and east, and unleashed a river of fire across the Italian heartland. He marched through Apulia and into Campania, the richest, most fertile land in Italy, the garden of the Republic. He burned the farms, slaughtered the cattle, and sacked the towns. It was a scar visible from space, designed to be a message: Rome cannot help you. Join me, and I will be your protector. In Rome, the Senate, facing this existential crisis, did the only thing it could. The system of two consuls had failed. The Republic was dying. They turned to an ancient emergency protocol, a measure last used in dire crisis. They voted to appoint a dictator. A dictator, in the Roman Republic, was not a tyrant. He was a temporary, absolute ruler given sole supreme command of the state for 6 months to solve a crisis that the normal government could not. The man they chose was the very picture of the old guard. He was Quintus Fabius, Maximus. Fabius was everything the defeated consuls were not. He was old, aristocratic, and deeply, profoundly pious. His first act as dictator was not to raise an army, but to publicly scold the people for Flaminius's impiety and to lead the city in massive, solemn religious ceremonies to restore the peace of the gods. He was calm. He was patient. He was methodical. His nickname was Avicula, the little lamb, for his mild demeanor, but beneath that mild exterior was a mind of cold, hard iron. Fabius was the man who had, as an ambassador, given them war in the Carthaginian Senate. He understood Hannibal in a way no one else did. He looked at the smoking ruin of 2 consular armies and came to a single, revolutionary, and deeply un-Roman conclusion. Rome could not beat Hannibal in a pitched battle. Hannibal was a god of the battlefield. To fight him was to lose. So Fabius decided Rome would not fight. He raised a new army, but he issued a new set of rules. This army would not engage the enemy. This army would not seek glory. This army would shadow Hannibal. It would stay on the high ground, in the hills and mountains, where Hannibal's terrifying Numidian cavalry was useless. It would harass his foragers. It would cut off his supply lines. It would burn the fields before Hannibal could get to them. Fabius would deny Hannibal the one thing he craved: a decisive battle. He would let hunger, time, and the Italian winter be his weapons. He would bleed Hannibal's army dry, one small cut at a time. The Fabian strategy was born, and for his trouble. The Roman people gave Fabius a new nickname: Conctator, the Delayer. What followed was one of the strangest campaigns in history, a great procession of 2 armies. Hannibal would march his men into a rich valley, and Fabius's army would appear on the hills above, watching. Hannibal would send out foraging parties, and Fabius's cavalry would swoop down, cut them to pieces, and retreat. Hannibal was infuriated. He was a lion, and Fabius was a cloud of mosquitoes, stinging and retreating, never letting him rest, never letting him fight. Hannibal redoubled his provocations. He burned the land with even greater cruelty, trying to enrage Fabius, to make him come down from the hills and fight. In a brilliant psychological move, Hannibal found Fabius's personal farm and ordered it to be left untouched, while everything around it was burned to the ground. His message was clear: your dictator is in league with me. He is a traitor. The trick worked. Back in Rome, the people were growing restless. They were Romans. They were the masters of Italy. And their army was hiding in the hills like bandits while their homes burned. They called Fabius a coward. Fabius ignored them. He continued his relentless, patient shadow war. And then he saw his chance. He trapped Hannibal. Hannibal had marched his army into a rich valley called Ager Falernus to forage. Fabius, knowing the terrain, moved with lightning speed. He sealed the only 2 mountain passes that led out of the valley. He placed his main army on one and a strong garrison on the other. Hannibal was stuck. His army was in a box. Fabius simply had to wait. The war, it seemed, was about to end, but Fabius was facing a genius. That night, Hannibal gathered 2,000 head of oxen from the captured herds. He had his men tie bundles of dry branches and torches to their horns. In the dead of night, the bundles were lit, and the terrified, burning oxen were stampeded up the hillside next to the pass that Fabius's garrison was holding. The Roman soldiers at the pass looked up. In the darkness, they saw thousands of bobbing torches, a massive army moving on the hill above them, as if to outflank them and attack them from the rear. Believing Hannibal's main force was escaping over the mountain, they did the one thing they should not have done. They abandoned their post in the pass and charged up the hill to engage the ghost army. As soon as the pass was clear, Hannibal, his one eye gleaming, quietly marched his entire veteran army, his cavalry and all his plunder, safely through the undefended trap. When the sun rose, Fabius saw what had happened. Hannibal was gone, and the ghost army was just a herd of cattle. Fabii used to return to Rome in disgrace. He had not only failed to fight, he had trapped the enemy and then been tricked like a child. The city was furious. His master of horse, his second-in-command, Marcus Minucius Rufus, was the new hero of the hour. Minucius was everything Fabius was not. He was young, aggressive, and he openly criticized the delayer. "We were sent to fight," he argued. "It's not to watch our allies be destroyed." In an unprecedented, insulting political move, the Roman Senate voted to promote Minucius, giving him equal command. The dictatorship was split in two. The army was cut in half. Fabius would command one half, and Minucius the other. Minucius, predictably, took his army and immediately sought a battle. He won a small, meaningless skirmish against some of Hannibal's foraging parties. Rome celebrated as if he had won a great victory. Hannibal saw this and set another trap. It was Trebia in miniature. He baited Minucius onto favorable ground, hid his elite troops in the ravines, and when Minucius charged, Hannibal's men sprang from their ambush and surrounded him. Minucius and his half of the army were about to be annihilated. From his camp in the hills, Fabius watched the disaster unfold. He had been proven right. He could have left his rival to be destroyed. It would have been the perfect, bitter, "I told you so." But Fabius was a Roman. He gave the order. His army charged down from the hills, smashed into Hannibal's flanking force, and saved Minucius from destruction. That day, a deeply humbled Minucius marched his surviving men to Fabius's camp, ceded his command, and called Fabius father. The Fabian strategy was at last vindicated, but it was too late. Fabius's 6-month term as dictator expired. The Roman people and the Senate had had enough. The Fabian strategy was correct, but it was slow, it was humiliating, and it was un-Roman. They were tired of hiding. They were tired of their farms burning. They were tired of being called cowards. The Republic made its decision. They would not appoint a new dictator. They would return to the old ways. They would elect 2 new consuls, and they would not raise a small army of shadows. They would raise the largest, most powerful army the Republic had ever assembled. They were done running. They were going to find Hannibal, and they were going to crush him. The stage was being set for the single darkest day in Roman history. The year 217 BC ended. Fabius the delayer, his dictatorship over, retired to the Senate. He had saved the Roman army from destruction, but he had lost the political war. The people of Rome were not grateful. They were furious. The Fabian strategy, while militarily sound, was a psychological and political failure. The sight of their farms burning, of an enemy army marching through their land unchallenged, was an insult that Roman pride could not endure. The mood in the city was no longer fear. It was a cold, hard, unified rage. They were done with delaying, done with hiding, and done with cowardice. The elections for the new consuls of 216 BC were a referendum on the war. And the man who captured this new angry spirit was Gaius Terentius Varro. Varro was the anti-Fabius. He was a new man, a populist, and his enemies claimed he was the son of a common butcher, a man who had risen to power on a tide of popular fury. He was loud, charismatic, and his entire campaign was a blistering attack on Fabius and the aristocracy. He stood in the forum and promised the people one thing: If they elected him, he would not delay. He would not hide. He would take the army, he would find Hannibal, and he would fight. He promised them a victory, swift and total. The people roared their approval and elected him by a landslide. The Senate, terrified by Varro's populism and arrogance, managed to elect one of their own as the other consul to balance the ticket. This man was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Paulus was the mirror opposite of Varro. He was an experienced, deeply respected aristocratic general. He was a protege and friend of Fabius. He was cautious, wise, and he understood exactly what they were facing. He had fought and won a difficult war in Illyria. He did not trust the roar of the crowd, and he had a deep, chilling respect for Hannibal's genius. This was the new command. The butcher's son and the aristocrat. The aggressive populist and the cautious veteran. The two men did not just disagree. They despised each other. And under the Roman system, they were given equal power, supreme co-command of the army. And what an army it was. Rome decided that this would be the final move. They would not just raise the standard for legions. They would raise an army of 8 legions. This was unprecedented. To this corps, they added an equal number of troops from their Italian allies. It was the largest single army the Roman Republic had ever assembled. Over 86,000 men, 86,000 soldiers, many of them new recruits, but all of them filled with a righteous Roman fury. This was not an army, it was a sledgehammer. The Senate gave the two consuls their simple, stark command: find the enemy and end the war. While Rome was building this monster, Hannibal was in Apulia, in southern Italy, and he was in trouble. The Fabian strategy had hurt him. He had failed to break the Roman Confederacy. No major allies had defected to his side. His army, while still veteran, was dwindling. His Gallic allies were restless, was running dangerously low on food and supplies, was deep in enemy territory, and a sledgehammer of 86,000 men was being raised to crush him. He needed a battle, but he needed it on his terms. He had to force the Romans to come to him, into a place of his choosing. In the late spring of 216 BC, Hannibal made his move. He marched his army with terrifying speed and seized the massive Roman supply depot at the town of Sena. It was a strategic masterstroke. In one move, Hannibal had captured a vast store of grain and supplies, feeding his starving army. But more importantly, he had thrown down the gauntlet. He had stolen the Roman army's own food. He had taken up a position on a wide, flat, dusty plain, sliced by the Aufidus River. It was a field perfect for his greatest weapon, his superior cavalry. He knew the Romans, especially Varro, could not ignore this provocation. They would have to come to him, and they did. The monster army marched south, 86,000 strong. The journey was tense. Varro and Paulus argued constantly. Varro wanted to march straight for Hannibal and attack. Paulus wanted to be cautious, to maneuver. To try and draw Hannibal into the hills, their fatal command structure made any single strategy impossible. They agreed to share supreme command, rotating it daily. One day, Varro's word was law. The next day, Paulus's. It was a system designed for disaster. They arrived at the Aufidus River. They saw Hannibal's smaller army. Perhaps 45 or 50,000 men camped across the plain. The Romans built a large camp. The air was thick with heat, dust, and tension. Lucius Aemilius Paulus rode out to survey the battlefield. He was horrified. Open ground and saw a death trap. If we fight him here, he told Varro, we are fighting on his terms. This is a field for cavalry, and his is better. We outnumber him. We must be patient. We must draw him into the hills where his horsemen are useless. Varro was contemptuous. He pointed to the 86,000 Romans. They outnumbered the enemy almost 2 to 1. Patience, he sneered. Patience is Fabius's word. It is the word of a coward. He accused Paulus of being afraid. A skirmish broke out as Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, in their characteristic harassing style, attacked the Roman soldiers trying to get water from the river. Varro, in command that day, ordered an attack and managed to drive them off. It was a tiny, meaningless victory, but for Varro, it was proof. Hannibal was weak. The time was now. The Roman army built a second, smaller camp on the same side of the river as Hannibal, a clear act of aggression. The two armies were now camped within shouting distance. The soldiers could see the enemy's campfires, hear their battle cries. The sun set on the 1st of August. The army was a coiled spring, humming with tension and hatred. The soldiers were eager. They had been promised a battle, a final, glorious extermination of the man who had haunted their land for 2 years. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, whose day of command it was, gave the order to stand down. He would not fight, but as the hot, dusty night fell, every man in the Roman army knew what the next day would bring. On August 2nd, 216 BC, supreme command of the largest army Rome had ever built would pass to Gaius Terentius Varro, and Varro was eager to fight. The morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, dawned hot and dry. A hot, gritty wind, the Vulturnus, was already blowing from the south, picking up the dust of the arid Apulian plain. In the Roman camp, the signal was given. The vexillum, the scarlet battle banner, was raised over the tent of Gaius Terentius Varro. It was his day of command. It was his day of glory. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, his heart heavy with dread, mounted his horse. He had argued against this, pleaded for caution, but the order was given. He was a Roman consul. His duty was to obey, to fight, and if need be, to die for the Republic. The Roman army, 86,000 men, began to move. It was the largest army Rome had ever sent to war, and Varro, its commander, had a plan of brutal simplicity. He did not trust his new recruits in a battle of complex maneuver. He would rely on one thing: sheer, overwhelming weight. Normally, the Roman legions fought in a flexible manipular formation, a checkerboard of units with gaps, allowing for movement. Varro abandoned this. He packed his legions tight. He narrowed the gaps, and he deepened the ranks. He created a single, monstrous, human battering ram. A wall of flesh and steel, a mile wide and, in some places, 72 ranks deep. Their plan was to march forward and smash Hannibal's center by an unstoppable avalanche of manpower. On their flanks, they had their weakness: 6,000 cavalry. Varro placed his best, the 2,400 citizen knights of Rome. On the right flank, by the river, under the command of Paulus, he placed his weaker allied cavalry, 3,600 men. On the left flank, in the open plain, under his own command, the battering ram was ready. Across the field, Hannibal, his one eye taking in the spectacle, prepared his response. He had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. He was outnumbered almost 2-1. He could not win a fight of brute force. He would have to win with his mind. First, he positioned his army facing north. This was a subtle, brilliant move. The morning sun was not in his men's eyes, and the hot Vulturnus wind, the wind of the vulture, was at their backs. It would blow the dust and grit of the battle directly into the faces of the 86,000 advancing Romans, blinding and choking them. Then he laid his trap in the center, where the Roman battering ram was aimed. He placed his weakest troops, his 20,000 Spanish and Gallic infantry, but he did not draw them up in a straight line. He did something no one had ever seen. He advanced his center, pushing it forward into a long, convex crescent, a bulge that jutted out to meet the Roman charge. This line was deliberately thin. It was designed to break. It was the bait, then, on either side of this disposable center. He placed his best troops, his 10,000 veteran African infantry. He held them back, in reserve, in deep, dense columns. They were the jaws of the trap, hidden in plain sight. They were dressed in the captured Roman armor from Trebia and Trasimian. Finally, his cavalry. His 10,000 horsemen were his masterpiece. He unbalanced his line. On his left flank, by the river, facing Paulus's elite Roman cavalry, he placed his own elite, 6,500 heavy Spanish and Gallic horsemen. Led by his most brutal commander, Hasdrubal, he gave them an overwhelming advantage in numbers. This was his hammer, on his right flank, in the open plain. Facing Varro's larger force of allied cavalry, he placed his 3,500 Numidians, led by Hannibal. Their job was not to win. Their job was to distract. The two armies stood opposite each other. The Romans, a single, massive, deep block. The Carthaginians, a thin, bulging crescent. Flanked by hidden jaws and two powerful, unequal wings of horsemen, the trumpet sounded. The ground began to shake. The battle did not begin in the center. It began on the flanks, with the cavalry. On Hannibal's left, by the river. Hasdrubal's 6,500 heavy horsemen smashed into Paulus's 2,400 Roman knights. The space was tight, hemmed in by the river and the advancing infantry. It was not a battle of wheeling and javelins. It was a medieval brawl. Men tore each other from their horses. They dismounted and fought with short swords, a churning mass of men and screaming animals. Paulus, fighting in the thick of it, was struck by a heavy slingstone that shattered his shoulder. But he refused to leave the field, fighting on through the pain. But the Carthaginian numbers were too great. The Roman cavalry, the flower of the aristocracy, was not just routed, it was annihilated. Wiped out? Simultaneously, on the other side of the field, the Numidians engaged Varro's allied cavalry. But the Numidians did not charge. They did what they always did. They swarmed. They rode in, threw their javelins, and retreated before the Romans could countercharge. They broke off into small squadrons, attacking the flanks and rear of the Italian horsemen. Varro's cavalry, eager for a glorious charge, was completely frustrated. They were being pulled apart, led on a pointless chase, unable to land a solid blow. They were held in place, neutralized. While the real battle was being decided elsewhere, the Roman cavalry on the right was dead. The Roman cavalry on the left was paralyzed. And now, the main event. The 86,000-man Roman battering ram, deafened by its own war cries, out. Blinded by the dust and the sun, marched forward. They crashed into the thin, bulging crescent of Hannibal's Gauls and Spaniards. The impact was terrible. The sound of steel on shields, of spears on bronze, was a deafening roar. The Roman line, 70 ranks deep, was an irresistible force. The thin Carthaginian line, as Hannibal had planned, began to bend. The Gauls and Spaniards groaned, their lines sagging backward. The Romans, sensing victory, roared in triumph. The center was breaking. Varro, seeing the enemy line collapse, ordered his legions to push harder, to pour into the gap. The Roman soldiers surged forward, driving the enemy back. The crescent, which had bulged out, was now bending in. It became a straight line. And then, as the Romans pushed with all their might, it became a concave pocket. The Romans, in their mindless, forward-pressing fury, charged deeper and deeper into the trap, their flanks becoming more and more compressed as they funneled into the shrinking space. They thought they were winning. They thought the battle was almost over. They had no idea that they were marching, shoulder to shoulder, into their own grave. The Roman legions were surging forward, a tidal wave of 80,000 men, their cheers echoing across the plain. They were winning. The Carthaginian center was collapsing, bending before their unstoppable weight. The Gauls and Spaniards, fighting with desperate courage, were being pushed back, forming a deep, U-shaped pocket. Deeper and deeper, the Romans plunged, a solid mass of men funneling into the trap, and then Hannibal gave the signal on the left and right flanks of the battle, where his 10,000 veteran African infantry had been standing still, watching. The order was given. The Roman legions, in their blind forward momentum, had now pushed past these two columns. The entire exposed flank of the Roman battering ram, 72 ranks deep, was now a helpless target. The African infantry did not charge. They performed a perfect, chilling, parade ground maneuver. The column on the left turned right. The column on the right turned left. In perfect unison, these 10,000 fresh, elite soldiers, dressed in captured Roman armor, advanced. They did not run. They marched, a grinding wall of steel, slammed into the unshielded left and right flanks of the Roman army. The Roman cheers died in their throats, replaced by screams of confusion and terror. Imagine you are a Roman soldier in the middle of that dense packed formation. You are pushing the man in front of you, fighting the terrified Gaul you can barely see. Suddenly, the man on your right collapses, a spear in his ribs. You look right, and you do not see a comrade. You see an African wearing your own armor, and he is stabbing your friend. Before you can react, you are hit from the left by another, the Roman army. A single dense block was suddenly being attacked from three sides. From the front, by the remnants of the Gallic center. From the left, by the African infantry. From the right, by the other African infantry. It was a three-sided box. It was a nightmare. But the trap was not yet complete. Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian cavalry commander, having finished his work by the river, had annihilated the Roman cavalry of Paulus. But he did not chase the few survivors. He rallied his 6,500 heavy horsemen. He looked across the field and saw that the Numidians were still toying with Varro's allied cavalry, holding them in place in a single, massive, thundering maneuver. Hasdrubal led his entire force on a ride around the back of the entire Roman army. The Roman legions, already compressed, already in a panic, heard a new sound. It was the sound of thousands of horse hooves. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry, joined now by the victorious Numidians, crashed like a tidal wave into the rear of the Roman formation. The trap was now closed. The double envelopment was complete. 86,000 Romans were now completely, totally and hopelessly surrounded by 50,000 Carthaginians. The battle ended. The fighting ended, and the slaughter began. The Roman army ceased to be an army. It became a single, compressed, suffocating mass of terrified humanity. They were packed so tightly, shoulder to shoulder, that they could not lift their arms to swing their swords. They could not even raise their shields to defend themselves. The Carthaginians on the outside of the circle simply had to push forward, a human winepress. The outer ranks of the Romans were cut to pieces, stabbed by spear and sword. The men in the center, tens of thousands of them, were not even killed by the enemy. They were crushed to death by the sheer panicked pressure of their own comrades. They suffocated, their lungs collapsing, dying on their feet, held up by the press of bodies. It was a cauldron of death, a machine of extermination. For 8 hours, the killing went on. The sun, which had risen on the most powerful army Rome had ever built, beat down on a field that had become a lake of blood, a mound of corpses 60,000 strong. And what of the consuls? Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the aristocrat who had known this was a mistake, fought to the last. His shoulders shattered, unhorsed, he sat on a rock, bleeding to death, watching the end of his world. A military tribune, recognizing him, offered him his own horse, pleading with him to flee. Paulus, in his final act, refused. He told the tribune to save himself. "Go," he ordered, "and tell the Senate to fortify Rome. Tell them to prepare for the worst. And tell Quintus Fabius, tell him that Aemilius Paulus died, remembering his warnings." As the tribune fled, Paulus stood, one last time, and walked back into the chaos. He was cut down by a dozen Carthaginian soldiers, none of whom knew or cared that they had just killed a Roman consul. On the other side of the field, the other consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, the butcher's son who had promised victory, saw the trap close. His cavalry, the allied horsemen, broke and fled, and Varro, the architect of the apocalypse, turned his horse and fled with them. He abandoned his 86,000 men to their fate, saving his own skin, and rode back to a Rome he had just condemned. The sun set on the field of Cannae. 50,000, 60,000, perhaps 70,000 Romans were dead. In one afternoon, Rome had lost more men than the United States would lose in the entire Vietnam War. Hannibal had lost 6,000. Mostly the Gauls who had formed the center. It was the perfect tactical victory. It was the single bloodiest day in European history, a record that would stand for nearly 2,000 years, till the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The masterpiece of Hannibal Barca was complete. The sun was setting. The 8 hours of killing were over. The field of Cannae was silent, save for the wind, and the groans of tens of thousands of dying men. Hannibal and his officers, His band of brothers, who had followed him from Spain, stood on a small hill overlooking the plain. They were not cheering. They were in a state of stunned, numb disbelief. They had done the impossible. They had not just defeated Rome, they had erased her. The army that was meant to be a sledgehammer lay broken in a million pieces. A mound of corpses so vast, it was said to have raised the level of the plain as darkness fell. The Carthaginian soldiers, exhausted, their arms aching from the slaughter, moved across the field. This was the grim harvest. They began to strip the dead. They took helmets, shields, and armor, and they took the rings. From the fingers of the dead senators, the tribunes, the thousands of Roman knights who lay among the common soldiers. They pulled the small gold rings that signified their rank. They gathered so many that Hannibal, as a demonstration of his victory, would later pour them out like pebbles onto the floor of the Carthaginian Senate. As Hannibal watched this grim spectacle, his brilliant cavalry commander Hannibal rode up to him. His face was not numb with awe. It was lit with the fire of victory. He clasped Hannibal's arm. "That was a masterpiece, General," he said, his voice alive with urgency. "But the war is not yet won. Let me prove the greatness of this victory. Give me the cavalry. Give me the Numidians. Let me ride now. While you rest the army, I will ride for Rome." His argument was simple and powerful. Rome was in a panic. She had no army. Her walls were undefended. The news of this apocalypse would arrive like a thunderbolt, and the city, leaderless and broken, would fall into despair. "I promise you," Hannibal declared, "if you let me go, in 5 days, you will dine on the capital." This was the moment. The great turning point of the war. The great what-if of human history. All of Hannibal's officers looked at their commander. The world held its breath. Hannibal was silent. He looked at the field of death. He looked at his exhausted soldiers. And finally, he looked at his eager lieutenant, and he shook his head. No. He told Hannibal that he needed time. He needed to rest his men. He needed to assess the situation. Hannibal could not believe what he was hearing. He had just handed his general the keys to the world, and the general was refusing to take them. In a flash of inspired, bitter, and prophetic frustration, Hannibal turned on his commander. "The gods, it seems," he said, "do not give all gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." And with that, he rode away. Was Hannibal right? For 2,000 years, historians and generals have debated that single moment. Was this the instant Hannibal lost the war? The answer is complex. Hannibal, the supreme strategist, was almost certainly correct from a military perspective. Hannibal was a cavalryman. He thought in terms of the charge. Hannibal was a general. He thought in terms of logistics. His army, while victorious, was exhausted, cut, and bruised. They were in no condition to force march 240 miles to Rome. More importantly, Rome was a fortress. Its Servian walls were massive. To take the city would require a long, grinding siege. Hannibal had no siege equipment. He had no battering rams, no catapults, no siege towers. His greatest weapon, his cavalry, was utterly useless against stone walls. A direct assault would have been a bloody failure, disaster that would have undone the miracle of Cannae. But Hannibal's greatest mistake was not military. It was strategic, and it was psychological. His entire strategy, from the moment he crossed the Alps, was not to conquer the city of Rome. It was to break the Roman Confederacy. His plan was to prove so devastatingly that Rome could not protect its allies, that those allies, the Samnites, the Campanians, the Greeks would abandon the Republic and join him, he believed. As he stood on that field, that he had already won. He believed the war was over. Cannae was the final bloody proof. The Confederacy would now collapse, and Rome, isolated and broken, would have no choice but to sue for peace. And so, he did not march. He sent a delegation to Rome, offering to ransom his few thousand prisoners, a civilized Greek-style end to the war. He then marched his army to Capua, the second richest city in Italy, which did indeed defect to him. He set up his winter camp, and he waited. He waited for the other cities to join him. He waited for the Roman ambassadors to arrive at his tent, on their knees begging for peace. But the ambassadors never came, because Hannibal, for all his godlike genius on the battlefield, had just made his first and his last fundamental miscalculation. He understood how to fight armies. He understood how to win battles, but he did not, in his heart, understand the Roman people. And he was about to find out what Roman resilience truly meant. While Hannibal stood on the field of victory, debating his next move, the first survivors of the apocalypse began to arrive in Rome. They were not an army. They were a shattered, bleeding, terrified rabble. They brought with them the news, and the news was the end of the world then. The consul himself, Gaius Terentius Varro, the man who had promised them victory, arrived. The man who had fled. The panic that had gripped Rome after Trasimene was a small tremor. This was the earthquake. The city collapsed into a state of paralysis. The wailing in the streets was so loud, so profound, that it was described as a city that had become one single, open wound. Businesses shut. The forum was empty, save for crowds of weeping women. The senators, those who were not dead on the field of Cannae, gathered, but they were in a state of shock, leaderless and broken. And then one man stood up, the man they had all mocked, the man they had called a coward, Quintus Fabius, Maximus, the delayer. In the midst of the chaos, he was the only one who was calm. He was the only one who had expected this. He took control. His voice cut through the panic. He gave orders with the cold, hard authority of the Republic. He ordered the city gates shut and barred. He ordered the wailing women to go home. "You will mourn your dead in your own houses," he commanded. "You will not infect the city with your grief." He restored order by sheer force of will. He sent messengers and scouts down the Appian Way to find out the one thing no one knew. Where was Hannibal? As Rome trembled, waiting for the one-eyed general to appear on the horizon, a small delegation arrived at the city gates. It was Hannibal's ambassador, a man named Carthage. He had come to offer terms. He had come to offer to ransom the thousands of Roman prisoners taken at Cinna. This was the moment of truth. Any other civilization, any other city-state in the ancient world, would have accepted. They would have paid the ransom, welcomed their survivors, and signed a peace treaty. The Roman Senate, led by Fabius, met the delegation. Their response would define them for eternity. First, they refused to even speak to Hannibal's ambassador. They sent a lictor, a public officer, to the gates with a simple message: "There is no one in Rome to speak with. Be off Roman soil by nightfall." They would not even acknowledge the man's presence. Second, the ransom. The families of the prisoners gathered in the forum weeping, begging the Senate to pay the gold and bring their sons and husbands home. The Senate debated, and then, in a moment of the most brutal, calculated, and terrifying resolve in human history, they refused. They made a public declaration. Rome had no need for citizens who had allowed themselves to be captured while they had a sword in their hand. They were to be left to their fate. They were no longer Romans. This message was a thunderclap. It was a message to Hannibal: "Your prisoners are worthless. We will not negotiate. We will not surrender. There is no price you can extract from us." And it was a message to every Roman citizen. The only options are victory or death. But beneath this iron resolve, the city was still terrified. They were terrified that the gods had abandoned them. The impiety of Flaminius, the disaster at Cannae, it was all a sign. The high priest consulted the forbidden Sibylline books, the ancient prophecies of Rome. The books demanded a dark, ancient, and horrifying price to restore the peace of the gods. In the city's cattle market, the Forum Boreum, Roman priests took to Gauls. A man and a woman, and 2 Greeks. A man and a woman, and they buried them alive. It was a human sacrifice, a desperate primitive act of a civilized people pushed to the very brink of oblivion, willing to do anything to win back the favor of their gods. And then, the final, and perhaps the most brilliant, act of this dark time: what to do with Varro, the consul of the people, the butcher's son. The man who had caused the apocalypse? The man who had fled while his colleague Paulus died at his post? By all rights, he should have been tried for treason and executed as a scapegoat, as Varro rode back into the city, his head bowed in the ultimate shame. The entire Roman Senate, led by Fabius Maximus himself, walked out of the Curia to meet him, and they did not arrest him. They did not scorn him. The Senate of Rome publicly thanked Gaius Tyrrenius Varro. They thanked him. Their official proclamation read, "Because he had not despaired of the Republic." This was a moment of political genius. By forgiving Varro, the man of the people, the aristocracy healed the fatal internal rift that had torn the city in two. They were showing Hannibal and the world that there were no more factions. There were no more patricians. There were no more plebeians. There was only Rome, one, unified and unbreakable. Hannibal, in his winter camp in Capua, feasted, rested his men, and waited. He waited for the allies to defect. He waited for the ambassadors of peace. He had won the greatest battle in history. But he had fundamentally misunderstood his enemy, because in Rome, the ambassadors were not coming. Instead, a new Rome was being forged in the fires of Cannae. They began to raise a new army. They lowered the enlistment age to 17. They opened the prisons and armed the debtors and criminals. They passed a state decree to buy 8,000 slaves from their masters, armed them, and promised them their freedom in exchange for service. They had no weapons, so they took the sacred, ancient trophies down from the walls of the temples, the armor of their ancestors, the captured shields of their old enemies, and they gave them to the new recruits. Rome was on its knees. It was stripped bare. It had no army, no money, and its gods were silent. But it had one thing left. It had resolve. The Fabian strategy was no longer a political debate. It was now the only strategy. Rome would never, ever face Hannibal in a pitched battle again. The war of attrition, the war of shadows, was back, and in Spain. The young man who had saved his father at the Ticinus, Publius Cornelius Scipio, was learning. He was learning from the man who had destroyed his country. He was learning how to be Hannibal, and he was waiting for his moment. Hannibal had won the greatest victory in history. He had destroyed the Roman army, and he had secured the defection of Capua, the second richest city in Italy. He marched his army there to spend the winter, to rest, and to wait for the Roman Confederacy to collapse. Roman historians, writing in the years to come, would point to this moment. The winter in Capua as the beginning of Hannibal's end. They wrote that his undefeated veteran army, exposed to the luxuries of a rich city to hot baths, soft beds, wine, and women, went soft. They claimed the lion of Africa had his claws and teeth pulled by comfort. This was a comforting lie. The truth was far more terrifying. Hannibal's army did not go soft, but it did get stuck. The war in Italy, which had been a symphony of lightning-fast, brilliant battles, now changed. It became a long, slow, grinding, and brutal war of attrition. It became a war that Hannibal could not win. Rome, having found its iron spine, had fully embraced the Fabian strategy. They would never fight him in the open again. Led by Fabius the Shield and a new, aggressive general named Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the sword Rome began to fight a new kind of war. It was a war of shadows. Hannibal, for all his genius, could not be everywhere at once. He was the master of the battlefield, but Rome now denied him a battlefield. It was Hannibal's personal nightmare. He would march his army south to save one of his new allies, and Marcellus would swoop in and lay siege to a city in the north. When Hannibal raced north to save that city, Fabius would attack his allies in the south. He was a lion, trapped in a cage the size of Italy, surrounded by hunters who refused to face him and who were one by one. Picking off his cubs, he was the greatest general in the world, with no one to fight. For 10 long, agonizing years, this continued. Hannibal marched up and down Italy, a ghost of his former terror, burning fields, but slowly bleeding. His army was dwindling. His veterans were dying of old age and disease. His Gallic allies were drifting away. He was trapped, His only hope lay not in Italy, but in Spain. His brother, Hannibal Barca, was there fighting his own desperate war against the Romans. The plan had always been for Hasdrubal to raise a second army, to follow in Hannibal's footsteps, to cross the Alps, and to link up. If the two sons of Hamilcar could unite their armies, they could at last storm the gates of Rome. But in Spain, a new Roman general had risen. The boy who had saved his father at the Ticinus River, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was a new breed of Roman. He was not a Fabius. He was not cautious. He was a student of Hannibal himself. He was charismatic, he was fast, and he was unpredictable. He took command of the shattered Roman forces in Spain, and in a brilliant assault that mirrored Hannibal's own genius, he captured the Carthaginian capital of New Carthage. He was winning. Hasdrubal, his back to the wall, knew it was now or never. In 207 BC, 11 years after Cannae, he gathered his army, broke out of Spain, successfully crossed the Alps, and descended into northern Italy. The nightmare of Rome had come true. There were now two Barcas in Italy. Hasdrubal sent messengers to his brother. The message was simple. I am here. Let us meet in Umbria. The war will be over. But the messengers never arrived. They were intercepted by a Roman patrol, led by the consul Gaius Claudius Nero, who was, at that very moment, shadowing Hannibal in the south of Italy. Nero read the captured letter. He knew in that instant that the fate of the Republic was in his hands. If the two brothers met, Rome was finished. So Nero did something unthinkable. He did something Hannibal would do. Without authorization, in defiance of Roman law, he abandoned his post. He took 7,000 of his very best, lightest troops and told the rest of his army to keep the campfires burning. To trick Hannibal into thinking he was still there, then he marched. He force-marched his men the entire length of Italy, hundreds of miles in just 7 days, a march of impossible speed. He moved in total secrecy and linked up with the other Roman consul in the north, who was waiting for Hasdrubal. Hasdrubal, expecting to fight one consular army, now saw the dust of two. He saw the reinforcements. He recognized Nero's men, and he knew he was discovered. He tried to retreat to the Metaurus River, but it was too late. The Roman armies, now combined and overwhelming, fell on him. The battle was a desperate, bloody affair. Hasdrubal, seeing that all was lost, did the last thing a Barca could do. He spurred his horse, alone, into the very center of the Roman legion, and was cut to pieces. The second Carthaginian army was destroyed. Nero, his grim work done, marched his 7,000 men all the way back to his camp in the south. He had been gone for 2 weeks. Hannibal had not even noticed he was missing. Hannibal was still in his camp, still waiting. He was scanning the horizon day after day for the dust cloud that would signal his brother's arrival. One day, a Roman cavalry patrol rode up to his stockade. They did not attack. They threw a large, heavy sack over the wall and rode away. Hannibal's guards, confused, brought the sack to his tent. When they opened it, they found the severed, wax-preserved head of his brother, Hast. This was the true end of the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal, the man who had never lost a battle, the man who had brought Rome to its knees, looked at the face of his dead brother, and in that moment, he knew that he had lost the war. He looked at the head and he spoke the most tragic words of his life. Now, he said, his voice quiet, now I see the fate of Carthage. The war in Italy was over. Hannibal was no longer a threat. He was a lion, his teeth pulled, trapped in the far toe of Italy and in Rome. The young Scipio, now returned from his total conquest of Spain, was hailed as a hero. He stood before the Senate, and he proposed a new, radical, terrifying idea. For 15 years, they had fought Hannibal in their own home. It was time, he said, to stop. It was time to take the war and all its horrors to the one place Hannibal could not ignore. It was time to invade Africa. Hannibal was trapped in Italy, a king in a prison of his own making. And in Rome, his great student, Publius Cornelius Scipio, had a radical, brilliant, and terrifying idea. For 15 years, Rome had fought a defensive war in its own home. Scipio stood before the Senate and argued that this was a fool's game. The only way to get the splinter out of Italy, he argued, was to inflict a greater wound on Africa. The only way to defeat Hannibal was to threaten Carthage. The old guard, led by Fabius, was horrified. They called it a reckless gamble, to send Rome's last army to a foreign continent while the enemy was still in their backyard. But Scipio, young, charismatic, and now the hero of Spain, won the debate in 204 BC. A Roman army, led by a Roman general who thought like a Carthaginian, landed on the shores of Africa. Scipio was a revelation. He was not a Fabius, and he was not a Varro. He was Hannibal in a Roman toga. He used speed, deception, and psychological warfare. He forged an alliance with the one weapon Rome had always feared, the Numidians. He convinced a powerful Numidian king, Massinissa, to betray Carthage and join him. He was Hannibal's mirror. He burned the Carthaginian countryside. He defeated their armies. He drove them back to the very gates of Carthage. The Carthaginian Senate, the same merchants who had refused to send Hannibal reinforcements, the same men who had let him wither on the vine in Italy for a decade, now panicked. Their homes were burning. Their city was at stake. They sent a desperate, groveling message to Italy, to the man they had abandoned. They recalled Hannibal. The message found Hannibal in the south of Italy, an old man now in his late 40s, his one eye scarred, his body weary. He had been in Italy for 16 years. He had never lost a battle. He had won at Trebia, at Trasimene, and had delivered the masterpiece of Cannae. And now he had to leave. The historians say he wept as he boarded his ships. He wept not for leaving Italy, but with rage. Rage at his own Senate, whose jealousy and fear had, he believed, cost him the war. He and the last hardened veterans of his great campaign. The old guard sailed away from the land they had dominated but could not conquer, the two titans. The old master and the young prodigy were now on the same continent. The final confrontation was at hand. Before the battle, on a plain near a town called Zema, the two generals met, face to face, between their armies. It is one of the most legendary moments in history. Hannibal, the old lion, spoke first. He spoke of the fortunes of war, of how he, too, had once stood where Scipio stood, on the verge of total victory. He warned the young Roman that fate was a fickle god, and he advised Scipio to accept a generous peace. Before the dice were rolled one last time, Scipio listened with the deep respect of a student, but his reply was pure, cold, Roman iron. He told Hannibal that the time for talk was over. The Romans had not broken the peace. Carthage had, the gods, he said, had willed this fight. And he intended to finish it. The two greatest generals of the age rode back to their lines. The Battle of Zama. In 202 BC was Cannae in reverse. Hannibal, for the last time, showed his genius. He had 80 war elephants, and he planned to use them to shatter the Roman line. But Scipio had learned. He had spent 15 years studying his enemy. He redesigned the Roman formation. He arranged his legions not in a checkerboard, but in deep, straight lanes. With wide corridors running through his army, when Hannibal unleashed his elephants, Scipio's men blew massive horns and trumpets. The terrifying noise caused the animals to panic. Some turned and trampled Hannibal's own cavalry. The rest, funneled by the Roman soldiers, charged harmlessly down the lanes Scipio had created, where they were killed by javelins from the side. The elephant charge, Hannibal's first move, was a total failure. Then the cavalry battle began. And for the first time, Hannibal was outnumbered in cavalry. Scipio's Roman horse, combined with his new, elite Numidian allies, crashed into Hannibal's flanks and shattered them, the Roman cavalry. Just as Hannibal's had done at Cannae, chased the enemy from the field in the center. The infantry battle was a terrible, slogging match. Hannibal's Italian veterans, his old guard, were the best infantry in the world. They were winning. They were pushing the Roman legions back. But Scipio, just like Hannibal, at a final move, as Hannibal's veterans were on the verge of breaking the Roman line, the victorious Roman and Numidian cavalry returned from their chase. They did not stop. They wheeled and they crashed, with devastating force into the rear of Hannibal's army. Scipio had done it. He had used Hannibal's own tactic, a double envelopment. A Cannae in reverse. Hannibal's army was annihilated. For the first and only time in his life, Hannibal Barca was decisively, catastrophically defeated on the field of battle. He escaped, rode to Carthage, and walked into the Senate. "I have lost," he told them, "not just a battle, but the war. You will accept any terms the Romans offer." The Second Punic War was over. The terms were brutal. Carthage was forced to give up its entire navy, all its foreign territories, its elephants, and pay a crippling, unpayable debt. It was forbidden, on pain of death, from ever waging war again without Rome's permission. Carthage was no longer an empire. It was a broken client state, living only by the mercy of Rome. Hannibal, the old general, tried to become a politician, to reform his city. But Rome, even in victory, never forgave him. They hunted him. He was forced into exile, a wanderer. An old man in a foreign court, always trying to raise one last army, to fight one last impossible war. Finally, in 183 BC, in Bithynia, near the Black Sea, he was cornered by Roman agents. He was nearly 70 years old. Rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, he took the poison he had carried in a ring for years. His last words, according to legend, were, "Let us now relieve the Romans of their long anxiety." Since they find it too long to wait for the death of an old man, he was gone. But his shadow and the shadow of his masterpiece would never leave. Cannae was the perfect battle. It would be studied by generals for the next 2,000 years. But the true legacy of Cannae was not the battle itself. It was the Roman response to it. Cannae was the day the Roman Republic was supposed to die. It was the day any other nation would have surrendered. But Rome refused. That day, on the dusty, blood-soaked plain of Apulia, the old Rome died, and a new, harder, more ruthless, and more resilient creature was born. Hannibal, in his quest to destroy Rome, had inadvertently forged the very weapon that would go on to conquer the known world. He had not destroyed the Republic. He had, in the end, created the empire.